US. What do you see in FinTech in Canada? Why do you come up here and invest in? And do you invest nationally? I know you've got some investments in Toronto, but do you have them across the country?
Yeah, generally, we kind of have a thesis of networks and communities, and so we try and focus our investing on Southern Ontario for what we do in Canada. And I wouldn't say we have a particular FinTech thesis only in Canada. I mean, finance is one of the largest industries in the world, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity. But we focus a little more broadly, at least in Canada. I'd say maybe 10% of our fund is FinTech. I'd say, what's appealing about Canada, and I thought and I'm sure we'll get into this more, there's a huge sort of, deep bench of very good talent, and it's extremely hard to recruit, especially engineers in Canada, in the Valley. I know I started my career at Google in 2006, and I remember thinking, all the people I went to school with are equally as good. I went to Waterloo as the people here at Google. Why are there not more big companies in Canada? And there were, RIM was very big, but I thought, the opportunity was much bigger than what we were, realizing. And so I think that's really appealing to us is if you partner great entrepreneurs with great talent, really good things happen. I'd say on the FinTech side, Canada has been maybe a little bit behind the US, which I've always thought was a little silly. I mean, I think I've always viewed Canada as potentially being the Switzerland of North America, right? Like, why shouldn't all the forward-looking regulation, why shouldn't all the innovation happen here? Why shouldn't, the majority of private wealth banking be going through Canada? Things like that. And I've always thought maybe the regulation's been a little bit too slow for, what I think is a huge opportunity, having direct access to one of the largest economies in the world, but, being much more regulated and I thought stifling innovation on that side a little bit more than I think is optimal if there's a much bigger play to be had. That's just my opinion.
Jeff, you've sold into the big banks. Is that a similar experience? Did you struggle getting the attention of the banks and eventually you landed CIBC as a big client, your marquee client?
I had brown hair when we started. That's an indication. So I think he's quite right. I mean, it's exceptionally difficult, time-consuming to sell into these organizations, and I think as you talk to guys that are just getting started in the space, they don't have an appreciation for what the sales cycle of selling into these organizations look like, and the amount of patience and really the amount of capex that to change your organization to be able to actually serve this space if you're lucky enough to be chosen, which typically happens in the cycle of years and not months.
I counsel my portfolio companies that they should have a strategy that is global, certainly beyond Canada, and target the US like Street Contacts with Alex. But you've got a slightly different strategy. I mean, I think you're Canada first or Canada only, and yet you've also struggled with the long sales cycle. So why not take the concept abroad?
So the short answer is there's a lot of advantages to be first. Our start predates calling the space FinTech by about 7 years. When we got started, we spoke about relationships with big organizations having reputational risk because nobody had heard of the concept of online lending or algorithmic lending. So having grinded it out early on, by the time we called the space FinTech, we were 7 years old, had about 100 employees, and were cash flow positive at the space. So that created somewhat of a competitive advantage and some defensibility to be able to go and shoot for these big relationships, which as I said earlier, require a certain level of patience and staying power to be able to go and realize.
You've got half a dozen or so FinTech companies. What's your experience among that portfolio of working in the Canadian marketplace, and what do you counsel your companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anything, there's advantages and disadvantages. I think some of the advantages for FinTech companies in Toronto, which are, I think, similar to the advantages of the whole startups ecosystem in Canada is you've got great talent here, great talent in terms of engineering talent. We've got a lot of entrepreneurs as our ecosystem is developing again. We're seeing second-time entrepreneurs and more experienced entrepreneurs. Even those first-time entrepreneurs are getting mentored from some great people. So on the talent side, that's great. We're seeing more capital than ever before, the lower cost of operating versus in most places in the U.S. And I think in terms of fintech specifically in Canada, there's a couple of unique challenges. First of all, like I sort of divide the fintech world into challengers and enablers, and some fintech companies can play in both, where you have like challengers that are going directly to consumers or to businesses. They're challenging the incumbents. They're going head to head, and then enablers are companies that provide technology to the incumbents. And there are a unique set of challenges for both. For the enablers, I think one of the key challenges, which was talked about before, is if you're selling into these large companies, it takes a long time to sell into them. So you basically need to develop your product. It needs to be extremely high quality, met to the highest security standards, and then it could take 2 or 3 years before you actually start sell in and make revenue. And then how are you going to fund your business in that period? And I think for the challengers, it's difficult because Canadians do not change their banks as quickly as Americans do. And so what we're seeing is a lot of these challengers that it takes a long time and is often expensive to figure out, hey, how do I actually scale my customer base? And so, the backdrop of all that for fintech is, hey, it costs a fair bit of money, often, not always, but often to get these companies up and going. And if you're just focused in the Canadian market, it's often very difficult to get significant funding, because whereas you have another, let's take it, another business, maybe a vertical SaaS company, it's easier for them to go in the US, and therefore it's easier to raise money from the US. Versus a Canadian fintech company, if you say, hey, just expand to the US, often you're dealing with very different partners, you're dealing with different regulations, which makes just, quote, going to the US much more difficult. And given that a lot of US funds are very hesitant to invest in Canadian-only companies. So you have this challenge for fintech companies in Canada where they're saying, hey, I got to spend a lot of money before I start making money, therefore I need to raise a lot of capital. However, it's more difficult to expand into the US, therefore most of them start with Canada and remain in Canada longer than other types of startups, and therefore it's harder for them to access the US capital. So it's a sort of a bundle of challenges that Canadian-based fintechs face.
So I think one of the biggest assets that we have in Toronto specifically, I speak from that experience, but in Canada in general, is a huge immigrant population where half of our city comes from somewhere else. I'm an example of that. Which means on these hot topics of diversity and inclusion, it makes it really easy to build cultures that are quite diverse with what we have locally over here. There's also a lot of talk to bring in, fast track some of the immigration processes. But currently in Toronto, we have some of the better schools in engineering that are producing fantastic technical talent. I've actually never had a problem hiring locally, even at scale. A lot of that is to do with, because we have such high quality talent to draw from, they also have opportunities to work anywhere that they want. And so we have to be as good or better than any of the other opportunities that would draw them to the south or to other companies in Toronto. That's to me the biggest challenge.
Yesterday, Mike McDermott, who's the CEO of FreshBooks, came out with an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. I'm sure you've read it. You certainly would have read it, given that they're most similar to you. And he says, I wish all the talent was here today, but it is not. Almost every time I start a search for a senior leader, I look south of the border.
I don't have that experience, but I know it is tough. Look, there's a lot of really good people in Toronto. There's a lot of good people out of Toronto. There's a lot of good people in the US, and it's about who you know and what your brand is and how to get the right person. I certainly wouldn't limit my search to a location if we couldn't find who we were looking for, but we have been able to find what we needed within arm's reach.
And with all you guys?
The complexity of talent today is you're not hiring from the fintech industry because the pool of people that work in the fintech industry is very, very, very small. So typically what you're doing is you're hiring from other industries. What we've learned in our own kind of experience has been people from banks typically don't fit our mold and don't fit our culture, even though we're a finance business. We've done exceptionally well in the gaming field, right? But to take somebody from gaming, you then need an onboarding process that would look far different from somebody that would know your industry, understand the language of the terms and what have you. So it's not enough to hire somebody, and I would concur with Ashira's point. The number of good people that are available is there, but you really need a system behind you.
I also went through and looked at the ranking of the fintech hubs globally, and Toronto was the only Canadian ranked center, and it was 10th globally, and it was in order was London, Singapore, New York, Silicon Valley, Chicago, Hong Kong, Zurich, Sydney, Frankfurt, and then Toronto. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Where should we be and what do we need to do about it?
What's interesting is, again, to the stats, is I saw stats that said, hey, Canada is the fastest growing, so it's growing, or it's one of the fastest growing. It's growing faster than Silicon Valley, faster than London, and faster than New York City in terms of the fintech segment. So we're smaller, but we're growing faster. I think that there is huge opportunity. I think, I enumerated some of the challenges before, but I think that we do have an opportunity to be much higher in the rankings. And what that means in terms of, hey, it's not just about competing and, hey, we want to be higher, but it means, hey, that means that we're going to create more successful fintech companies in Canada, which means more wealth, more jobs, more opportunity.
We adopted the language of collaboration very late. There's no two ways about it. The language that we wish to partner with fintechs, we wish to enable fintechs, we wish to finance fintechs, we wish to share our data with fintechs. This is all a very new language. So the reason why the rate of growth in the segment is accelerating now is because we're starting from a very low place. This is a relatively recent language. 7 years ago, in what we term the pre-fintech era, we couldn't get in the front door at a bank to have a business development conversation. There was not the wealth of funding that's available to the industry today. There were no incubators, accelerators, hubs. There were no syndicates to share data. So if you look at the time horizon, this is all very recent. So we have a lot of catching up to do, but the reason why we're catching up is because the change in our language happened well after the change in other geographies.
Is there enough capital for fintech startups and growth companies in Canada, or do we have to go south of the border for some of it?
With the exception of the early stages, but even then, I'd like to share this story of a Canadian entrepreneur who I thought did a particularly good job of fundraising, but I think if you really want money and you're hungry enough, you can get it. So I have a friend, Nikolai, we invested in his company called OpenCare, and he wanted to raise a seed round. Nobody in Canada would give him money. It's not a fintech company, but I think the story stands. And what he did was he's like, I'm going to win. I'm going to get the money. He knew nobody in Silicon Valley. He got on a plane, one-way ticket. He said, I'm not leaving Silicon Valley until I have $3 million. Took him 3 months, and he did it. And he got the founder of Thumbtack on his board. He knew nobody. He just cold emailed people, met them, impressed them, and raised a seed round one angel at a time. So I think if you're really determined, you can get the money. It's a lot of people want it to come easily. It's a little harder. If you're not based in Silicon Valley, it's going to be a little harder, but it is possible, even at the early stages. And then when you have traction, yeah, people will give you money, but that's not the hard part of fundraising.